Committee will come to order. Ms. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Let me start by saying that we all here wish you a full and speedy recovery. We understand you are still recovering, and sitting for too long is not the best thing for your health. So in consultation with the ranking member, we've agreed to your request to limit your appearance today to 2 hours. To get to as many questions as possible, I ask unanimous consent to reduce the time for questions to 4 minutes. Without objection, so ordered. To members, if we can't get to you today, you please submit your questions for the record, and the Secretary has assured us he will get answers to those back in a timely fashion. Also, the Secretary will be back in about a month to testify again, so you'll have another opportunity at that time. Ms. Secretary, the reason we've asked you here today is not to discuss your health. We're here today to determine why the President was not immediately informed of your incapacitation. The timeline, as we understand it, is this. On the evening of January 1st, Secretary Austin was transported to the hospital via ambulance for complications stemming from a surgical procedure he had on December 22nd. On the afternoon of January 2nd, the Secretary's authorities were transferred to Deputy Secretary Hicks without her even being informed as to why. On January 4th, 3 days after the Secretary's hospitalization, Deputy Secretary Hicks and the President were first informed that Secretary Austin was in the hospital. On January 5th, Congress is informed of the Secretary's hospitalization. It's totally unacceptable that it took 3 days to inform the President of the United States that the Secretary of Defense was in the hospital and not in control of the Pentagon. Wars were raging in Ukraine and Israel. Our ships were under fire in the Red Sea, and our bases were bracing for attack in Syria and Iraq. But the Commander-in-Chief did not know that his Secretary of Defense was out of action. Even the Deputy Secretary, the person to whom your powers were transferred, didn't know that you were in the hospital. Our forces conducted a pre-authorized strike on Iranian-backed militia in Iraq during this period. Had something gone wrong with the strike, or worse, if there was an attack on the United States, precious time would have been wasted while the President sought in vain to find his Secretary of Defense. The chain of command doesn't work when the Commander-in-Chief doesn't know who to call. That's why we want to know who made the decision to withhold that information from the President. And although you publicly stated you are solely responsible, you've also informed this committee that it wasn't you who decided to withhold the information from the President. We were led to believe your 30-day interval internal review would shed light on that matter, but it includes no explanation of why the President and his staff were left in the dark. It makes no recommendations to improve communication with the White House, and unsurprisingly, it holds nobody accountable. We appreciate your desire to protect your subordinates, but it's important in democracy that public officials are held accountable when mistakes are made. This administration has gone to great lengths to avoid accountability whenever possible. But this is a matter of national security, and someone needs to be held accountable. Furthermore, I find it very concerning that the Secretary could be hospitalized for 3 days without anyone else in the administration even noticing. That suggests Secretary Austin's advice is not sought or heeded in the White House, even while military operations were ongoing in the Middle East. It also implies that the White House politicals, not seasoned defense professionals, are in the driver's seat on matters of national security, which is very disturbing. Finally, beyond the immediate need to inform the President, Congress also has a right to know of secretarial absence or transfer of authority. Ironically enough, None of this would have come to the attention if the White House hadn't demanded that the department come clean to Congress and the public. Ultimately, our goal today is to understand how and why this happened so we can ensure it never happens again. With that, I yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, for any statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. And I will point out to members that in a little more than a month, the Secretary will be back, and he will be here for the full posture hearing, which will go on considerably longer than 2 hours. So that accessibility I do appreciate from the Department of Defense. This is an opportunity to address an important issue. And I will say I agree with much of what the chairman said. I think the lack of transparency and clear communication about what was going on with the DoD, certainly with the White House, but also with Congress and others, should not be repeated. We need clearer, more transparent information about what's going on at the Pentagon. I do want to disagree with just one thing the chairman said about how during the time period when you were in the hospital, the commander-in-chief didn't know who to call. He did. The transfer of power was made. It was made to the deputy secretary. And if anything had come up, that's the way the system works. When the Secretary of Defense is out of commission for any reason, Deputy Secretary assumes those responsibilities and roles, and that was made clear throughout the Pentagon and to the White House. Now, the reason behind it was not, and that's where I think the lack of transparency is problematic. I think we need to understand the importance of the role of the Secretary of Defense responding directly to the Commander-in-Chief. The Commander-in-Chief should have all the broad range of information about what's going on with the Pentagon. Even though, again, in this instance, there was no question who was in charge in that time, the transfer was done in accordance with the law and done appropriately. So I think it is appropriate that we have this hearing, that we have this discussion, that we hear directly from the Secretary. We have to work very closely with the Secretary as well as the Department to exercise our constitutional role of oversight of the Department of Defense. So to have those open lines of communication is crucial. I thank the Secretary for being here, being willing to explain that and take those questions. I do also want to emphasize that throughout this whole process, an incredibly complex threat environment. I think that's one thing on this committee absolutely everybody agrees to. There have been few times in our history when we've faced the set of challenges that we face right now. The war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, trying to make sure that it doesn't spread, the challenges that China continues to present, North Korea as well. Throughout that whole time, there is no allegation whatsoever that the Department of Defense was not completely on top of all of those situations. There was no instance where they were not doing their job to the utmost of their ability and in the defense of this country. In fact, I would point out that the coalition that Secretary Austin has been very responsible for helping to put together to stop Putin in Ukraine has been remarkably effective, and it's a testimony to Secretary Austin's leadership and the way the Department of Defense has been run on a day-in and day-out basis. I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that it would be helpful if the United States House of Representatives would be willing to allow a vote on the much-needed aid for Ukraine and the Middle East and to pass the appropriations bills the Department of Defense could desperately use to better carry out that job. But there's no doubt that the coalition that has been built has been incredibly successful. 2 years ago, when the war started, everybody assumed that Ukraine would be done in a month. Here we are 2 years later, and they are a sovereign democratic nation still, in large part because of the bravery of the Ukrainian people, but also because of the coalition that has come together to help protect them that the Secretary has led. Even in the Middle East, a chaotic and difficult situation, we have stopped that war from spreading. The response to the attacks and the tragic death of 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan has for the moment blunted those attacks from the Shia militia. The Houthis are proving to be a much larger challenge in Yemen, but we have once again built a coalition to confront that challenge. So as we look at this question of what happened while the Secretary was in the hospital, and admittedly the lack of transparency that needs to be improved, let's not lose track of what the Department of Defense is doing right now to meet the national security challenges that we face. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Ms. Secretary, you recognize 5 minutes for any opening statements you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee, good morning. I'm grateful to this committee for your continued support for the Department of Defense and our outstanding troops. The U.S. military is the most powerful fighting force in human history, and with your help, we're going to keep it that way. The Department is deeply focused now on meeting the pacing challenge from the People's Republic of China, on making the Middle East more secure after the October 7th terrorist assault on Israel, and on ensuring that Ukraine can continue to defend itself against Putin's war of aggression. So as always, we are focused on the defense of our nation. But I know that Congress has some legitimate concerns about some issues around my illness. So let me start by thanking all those who've offered me well wishes after my recent cancer treatment and hospital stay. I very much appreciate your kind words, and I received world-class medical care at Walter Reed. And I want to again publicly thank my doctors and the outstanding nursing staff. They expect me to be completely cured of my prostate cancer, which was caught early. And I continue to recover, and now I want to be very clear. There was never any lapse in authorities or in command and control. At all times, either I or the Deputy Secretary was in a position to conduct the duties of my office. But we did have a breakdown in notifications during my January stay at Walter Reed, and that is sharing my location and why I was there. And back in December, I should have promptly informed the President, my team in Congress, and the American people of my cancer diagnosis and subsequent treatment. Again, we did not handle this right, and I did not handle it right. As you know, I've apologized, including directly to the President, and I take full responsibility. I'm also taking responsibility for some institutional changes to make sure that this cannot happen again. It's not enough for me to pledge to do better. The system must be postured better to make the appropriate notifications when authorities are transferred. And my staff must be ready to carry all of this out. But let me be clear, I never intended to keep my hospitalization from the White House or from anybody else. That's why we immediately instituted changes to the way that the authorities can be temporarily transferred to my deputy and to the way that notifications get made. That's also why we conducted a 30-day review of the entire process. Now, because the review deals with the continuity of operations, its drafters wrote it as classified. But of course, we've shared that review with all of you. The 30-day review made 8 recommendations to me, and I've directed that all 8 recommendations be implemented. We put 2 in place already, and we're moving out quickly on the other 6. So let me quickly summarize them for you. We've made clear that we expect full information sharing when a deputy or another designated official assumes the functions and duties as acting secretary. We've issued written guidelines for clear information sharing between my staff and the deputy secretary staff if these scenarios arise. And we'll ensure that the department officials in the order of succession are familiar with and supported for the relevant processes. And we're moving quickly to develop a mandatory reporting protocol for personnel who support me or the Deputy Secretary in situations that might affect our ability to perform our duties and functions. Of course, we already have continuity of operations plans in place, and we'll continue to review and update those plans as appropriate. Now, even before the 30-day review, we already had made some changes. In the future, if the Deputy Secretary ever needs to temporarily assume the duties of my office, she and several White House offices will be immediately notified. That includes the White House Situation Room and the White House Chief of Staff. The key officials across the department will also be notified, including the Deputy Secretary, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the General Counsel. And the reason for that assumption of duties will be included in writing. As you saw these new procedures in action during my hospitalization earlier this month. And finally, the DoD Inspector General is still working on his own independent review, which we fully support. Now, before I take your questions, I want to again make one thing very clear. At no time during my treatment or recovery were there any gaps in authorities, and there were no risks to the department's command and control. And from the time that I resumed my duties on January 5th, I fully participated in national security decision-making on events in the Middle East and about military operations in self-defense to protect our troops and our facilities over there. Again, we're moving swiftly to put some helpful new procedures in place, to prevent any lapses in notification. And I am confident that we will not experience the same issues in the future. So let me again thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for everything that this committee does to support, to stand by the mission and the people of the Department of Defense, including their families. I know you understand this, but one of the best things that you can do right now to support them is to pass a full-year appropriation. In doing so, we'll ensure that our troops get paid, that our civilian employees can stay on the job, and that we can continue to procure and field the very best capabilities to defend our country. We need the flexibility and stability that full-year appropriations provide. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, I appreciate your leadership on that score, and I stand ready to assist you in any way. And with that, I'll be glad to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Chairman now yields his question time to the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, help us get this straight. At what point during your hospital stay did you or your staff decide that the President should know about your hospitalization?
As I understand it, my Chief of Staff contacted the National Security Advisor and advised him that I'd been hospitalized on the 4th of January.
At what point during your stay was the 4th of January?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
How long into your stay was that?
Well, as we've pointed out, as it's been pointed out earlier, I was admitted to the hospital
after you were
on the 1st
hospitalized?
of January. Right.
Okay. Yes or no, did you tell your staff not to inform the President, anyone on your staff?
I never told anyone not to inform the President, the White House, or anyone else about my hospitalization.
Okay, so the 30-day review summary lays a lot of blame at the feet of your staff. It seems that would appear, correct? For the breakdown in the process? You've told us that you are responsible, but the 30-day review seems to blame your staff.
Well, the 30-day review pointed out that that there were some missteps, but there was never any ill intent or an intent to obfuscate. So,
1 year ago, you told me in this hearing room you had no regrets about what happened in Afghanistan. Do you regret what happened here?
I've said that we didn't get this right, Congressman, and we put measures in place to ensure that the notification process is improved going forward.
Mr. Secretary, who will be held accountable?
The transfer of authority was
who will be held accountable for this? This embarrassment.
Again, I take full responsibility, and we put measures in place to address the shortcomings.
Are you surprised the President didn't call for your resignation? I'm surprised, but are you surprised that he didn't call for your resignation?
The President has expressed full faith and confidence in me. So
you're not surprised that he didn't call for your resignation. Is it typical that the President would go 3 days without talking to his Secretary of Defense? Is that typical, or is that a regular posture? Do you usually go days without talking to the Commander?
I mean, that can happen. It depends on whether or not the President's on travel. If I'm on travel, there are times when we do go days without direct communication.
So the big issue for me here is either the President is that aloof or you are irrelevant. Which one is it, Mr. Secretary? That the President would go 3 days without knowing that his Secretary of Defense is not on the job?
It's neither. The President is not aloof, and I am. I participate in all of the.
Let me ask you this. Well, on January 2nd, while you were in the hospital, President Biden was vacationing in the Caribbean. Your deputy, who the President didn't even know had operational control, was on a beach in Puerto Rico. What kind of message does that send to our adversaries?
The key piece is that, number one, the deputy has the ability to, she has access to secure communications. She has the ability to participate in decision-making processes from wherever she is.
Mr. Secretary, our adversaries should fear us, and what you've done has embarrassed us. And let me sum this up by this. A leading Chinese propaganda outlet said that what happened to you exposed, quote, internal chaos. A leading Russian propaganda outlet said that your disappearance, quote, effectively compromised the chain.
Gentleman's time's expired.
They should
Chair
be
now
afraid of
recognizes
us. You've embarrassed us.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
First of all, let me say it is not remotely surprising to me that the Chinese and the Russians are not going to say anything positive about us. That doesn't come as a surprise to me. They seize on every opportunity to attack the United States. So I don't really take their word for what was going on. And a couple things to drill down on. One, it is fairly routine that the Secretary of Defense will be in places where you are not able to do everything you need to do, and that authority is transferred. I think a lot of people don't fully understand this. So can you walk us through, I mean, how often does it happen that you are in a place where you can't be as responsive as you need to be so that you pass the authority on to your Deputy Secretary?
Thanks. As pointed out in the 30-day review, there have been a number of times in the past where we transferred authorities because of my inability to have access to secure communications. And then once I had the ability to have access again to secure communications, that was transferred back. So that, and the number of times that that's happened is outlined in the 30-day review.
And was there, again, just to emphasize, was there any time during this process, in the first days of January when you were in the hospital, any time whatsoever when the Deputy Secretary wasn't in a position to fully carry out the responsibilities of the Secretary of Defense, regardless of whether she was in Puerto Rico or Bermuda, Mexico or Mar-a-Lago or wherever, she was in a position to carry out all of the authorities that she had as the acting Secretary of Defense in that instance, correct?
She is legally and logistically positioned to assume the functions, and she was, you're right, in a position to be able to support the president as chief of staff, as he made decisions. So, commander in chief. So, she always has secure communications with her, just like me, and she has the situational awareness that's needed to be able to make effective recommendations to the president, and she, working with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and also the combatant commander, would propose options for the president in any situation.
Certainly, and one of the things I want to emphasize as this hearing goes forward is not to use this to the advantage of our adversaries, to use it as a partisan attack. There was nothing embarrassing about what happened here. There was nothing that makes us appear weak. The United States, as all of this was going on, as has been pointed out, was carrying out strikes against our adversary in order to protect our force. We were doing everything that we needed to do to meet the national security needs of this country. And if members of this committee incorrectly imply otherwise, they are merely giving aid and comfort to those adversaries that they claim to care about confronting. And I will also one more time emphasize that if we care about confronting our adversaries, rather than nitpicking the Secretary of Defense about his precise process in this situation, we should go ahead and pass the National Security Supplemental that the Senate has passed with 70 bipartisan votes to precisely meet those national security needs. Whatever Russia and Chinese propaganda machines may be cranking out about this situation, I assure you it pales in comparison to what they're cranking out about the fact that they think the United States is getting ready to abandon our ally in Ukraine. I would challenge any member on the other side of this aisle to claim that the Secretary of Defense not fully informing the President for 3 days is somehow more important than walking away from that obligation that we have made and that the whole world is watching us on. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Mike Rogers. Secretary Austin, I first want to wish you a full and speedy recovery. And sadly, we're here today because of the failure to properly communicate Directive 3020.04 of the Department of Defense, which is critical information requirements through the chain of command to President Biden. As a grateful veteran myself, along with you, of the American Armed Forces, we both understand the crucial role of the chain of command to provide time-sensitive information to make the right decisions at the right time. When communications fails, there is an increased risk to mission success, but more importantly, increased risk to the servicemen and women. For this, to me, it's personal. As a 31-year Army veteran myself, having 4 sons who served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Egypt, and currently my district director is deployed in Africa, I just take this personally with the South Carolina National Guard, that your service is just so critically important. And I appreciate having worked with you before your appointment, and we need your proven capabilities more than ever, as we are in a war we did not choose, of dictators with rule of gun invading democracies with rule of law. It began February 24, 2022, with war criminal Putin invading Ukraine. On October 7, 2023, Iran puppet Hamas invaded Israel as the Chinese Communist Party threatens Taiwan. Sadly, Biden opened borders for terrorists, makes imminent more 9/11 attacks across on American families, and we need our state National Guards to be ready for duty. Every family actually should have a rally point when communications are cut with an attack. With the current global threats, today, there are attacks on American and our allies by Iran in the Middle East. Would the lack of proper communications degrade our ability to respond?
Again, I would emphasize that there was never a break in command and control. We transferred authorities in a timely fashion. What we didn't do well was the notification of senior leaders. So. And we put measures in place to fix it.
I deeply regret the response we had was ineffective by delaying a response, and it should have been an immediate response on launch sites, and it should have been very effective, and there should have been no notice. And so what was done really has put American families at greater risk. And as I conclude, I want to express our sympathy for the family of Alexei Navalny, who was assassinated by war criminal Putin. His widow, Yulia, is a hero for the oppressed people of Russia. I yield back.